Hello everybody, Raven Knight here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whatever time it is for you. I want to thank you guys so much for coming back to this series that I've started on the book of Romans. If you don't know what's going on here, I am doing a biblical walkthrough of the book of Romans all the way from chapter 1 all the way to the end. I've already done an introductory video basically explaining what the book of Romans is about and what I plan to do with this series. So if you're brand new, I highly recommend clicking on that video and giving it a watch before coming to this one. But for those of you who have already seen it, no preamble necessary. We know exactly what we're doing. So go ahead if you will, and if you have a Bible, I would take it out right now. If you don't have a Bible, just follow along with me. We're going to the book of Romans, and how you get there is you go to the New Testament. You start with Matthew. That's the first book of the New Testament. And then you walk through. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then Romans is right after Acts. So pretty easy to get to. So we are going to be jumping right into the first chapter, and just a little refresher for you guys. If you don't remember, I mentioned that the reason Paul was writing this letter was because at this point in time, the Roman church was having a bit of a schism, a bit of an issue between its Gentile Christians, who were non-Jewish, and the Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians were convinced that in order to be a true Christian, you still had to follow Jewish practices like circumcision, eating proper Jewish food, celebrating the Sabbath, stuff like that. The Gentiles, meanwhile, were saying that's not necessary. We can still live by our old customs. We don't need to follow Jewish customs. Paul is here to set the record straight by explaining the nature of salvation, what it is to be saved, what that looks like, and why these kind of debates and debacles are not as relevant as you think they are. But in order to get started on the message of salvation, you need to start by explaining what you're being saved from. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Like, we can talk all the time about, oh man, I'm saved, I'm forgiven. But the big question has to be asked, well, what are you saved from? What's the importance of salvation? What's the necessity of forgiveness? So we need to start there, and that's what Paul starts with. So we're going to start on chapter 1, verse 1. Funny thing about the opening of this letter, Paul opens his letters for the most part the same way. He opens it with four pieces. First, he starts by identifying the writer. That's him. So like introducing himself. Then he emphasizes the reader who is receiving this. Then he'll offer some kind of thanksgiving, like thanks to God for a blessing or for being able to reach them or for how they're doing. And then finally, he will end with a theme, like what is the theme of this letter that you're about to hear. So follow along, see if you can't catch it. Verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets and the Holy Scriptures regarding his son, who as to his earthly life was a descendant of David. Now let's stop right there for just a second, because that is important. When Paul mentions David here, he is referring to Isaiah 9:7, which was a prophecy from the prophet Isaiah that the Messiah would come as a descendant of David. Now you might think, why is that important? Because it emphasizes the meaning of who Jesus was. We're not just talking about some random person here. Jesus was prophesied and planned and foretold about a long time ago. So it is emphasizing the divinity and prophecy of Jesus here. So let's keep going. All right. And who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him we receive grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. And you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. So right here, I want to remind you, all of this is a reminder of salvation for the Jews and Gentiles. Note what he says right here in verse 6. In verse 5. Through him we received grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. And you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. So he's emphasizing that this is for everyone, Jewish and Gentiles alike. To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. So his introduction, so like I said, we're in four structured parts. He's done his introduction, and he's identified who he's writing to. So he's introduced himself. I am Paul, apostle of Jesus Christ. You are the Jews and Gentiles in Rome who I'm speaking to. Let's get into the good stuff, right? All right, so we're going to jump into verse 8. And you're going to hear some very cool stuff here. Paul basically talks about the state of the Roman church and what he thinks of it. And this is where we get to the thanksgiving portion of his introduction. Verse 8. First, I thank my God. See, there it is. Thanks. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you. And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you, so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have among the other Gentiles. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. So let's take a moment to break all this down. That was a lot. That was 8 through 15, if y'all weren't following along. Lots of verses. But essentially what this is this is the big thank you that we're talking about. This is the big thanks be to God that y'all are doing so well. He opens up right here by saying that everyone's been hearing all about you. In verse 8, because your faith is being reported all over the world. Keep in mind, Rome was a relatively new church at the time. The church in Rome was relatively new, and Paul has not been there yet. None of the apostles have been there yet. But despite that, the church is growing vast and strong to the point that people around the world are talking about it, and Paul's kind of excited. Paul is very, very excited to hear about this. And he's talking about how I keep you in prayers at all time in verses 9 through 10. God, whom I serve in my spirit, is preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times, and I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. So Paul's been praying about Rome for a while. Very much concerned, hoping, just really yearning to go see them. And he's been held up. He explains that. I long to see you, verse 11, I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have it among the other Gentiles. And I think that this is very important. I think this is clever what Paul's doing. The first thing that he's doing is he's making it clear, hey, I know that I haven't been to see you guys yet, and you might be wondering why. It's not because I don't want to. It's not because I don't want to see you, but I've been held up. Things have been keeping me back. I've got a lot to do here. In fact, what am I doing here? Well, I am visiting the other Gentiles, he says in verse 14. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. He's basically saying the reason I've been held up is because I've got people all over the place, Gentile and Jew, who need to hear the message, and that takes my time a whole lot. This is a little bit of a subtle message to the Jews as well, by basically saying, Jews, don't look down on your Gentile brothers. They are just as worthy of the gospel. This is a little call out saying, I am preaching to the Greeks and non-Greeks, to the wise and to the foolish, to everybody. Everyone's getting the message. I'm not playing favorites, And I think that's a good reminder. To give you a personal example of mine, I was planning to go on a mission trip to Japan a couple of years ago. This was back before Corona really kicked in. And I was very excited to go to Japan. I was very pumped. We'd put down all of our money. We were ready to get going. But then all of a sudden, the coronavirus hit, and the Tokyo Olympics were canceled, and thus the mission trip was canceled. And I was very upset. I was very sad about that. And I wondered, why didn't God want me there yet? Why didn't God want us to go there yet? Weren't we meant to do his? But sometimes God holds us up sometimes and does things in his own time frame. Sometimes the things we really want to do, the places we really want to go, or the people we really want to meet, we've got to take a step back and recognize it's not quite time yet. We've still got work to do where we are. And that's what Paul is essentially saying. I want to go see you, Rome. I'm very excited. Don't think I don't want to see you. But I've not been able to go yet because I got people to reach here first. But now Paul's excited because he's getting ready to come. So he's been very thankful. So that was our Thanksgiving. Now we got to get into the theme here. All right, so we're picking up on verse 16. Ready for this? Here we go. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Okay, that was 2 verses. But this is presenting the whole theme of the book of Romans. These two verses basically explain the theme that we're going to be saying. First, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Here's a question to all my Christian viewers out there. And you don't need to answer in the comments or anything. I just want to know. How many of you have ever felt ashamed of your faith? I don't mean like you feel bad about it. I mean like you're scared to talk about it. Like you feel like, man, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to talk about this? Do I want to seem like a Bible beater? How many of you have ever thought that? And I'm not judging you. There are times I've thought the same thing. There are times that a lot of my friends and family have thought the same thing. It's funny, I've gotten a lot of people who have criticized me from going from a simple gaming YouTuber or history YouTuber to talking about my faith more and more. But I'm not ashamed of my faith. I'm not ashamed of sharing it. There's a time and a place to share it, but I'm not ashamed of sharing it. And here Paul is saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why aren't you ashamed? Because, here's why you shouldn't be. Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Why should we be ashamed of that which saves the world? I was reading a comic book the other day, and it was showing a superhero rescuing some kid. And the kid ran off to go tell all of his friends, oh my gosh, did you see that? I got saved by Superman. I got saved. And all the kids are like, really? You got saved? Yeah, I got saved by Superman. Why can't we say the same thing about Jesus? Isn't that what the gospel's meant to be? We get saved, so now we go tell other people about it? I mean, if I got saved by Superman or Wonder Woman or Spider-Man or whatever, I wouldn't keep quiet about it. That'd be the first thing on my social media pages. And yet there are people who act like they don't want to, who are a little scared of it. And just think about that. I'm not judging anyone, but it's something to consider. How often do you feel kind of like you want to keep quiet about your salvation? It's just a question. He says, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Now, you might think that's playing favorites. You might think, well, look at that. He's saying first the Jew, then the Gentile. Well, keep in mind that the Jews at this point in time were considered the people of God. They were considered God's chosen. And Jesus was born a Jew. He was born to the Jews. But now with Jesus' sacrifice, resurrection, and salvation being offered, it is no longer exclusive to the Jews. So what he's presenting the timeline. This was originally something that was offered to the Jews, but now it's offered to everyone. All right, so, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. You're going to hear that word righteousness repeated a couple times here. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now that is actually quoting Habakkuk 2:4, in which it says, the righteous shall live by faith. Great verse. Not going to go into it right now because we're focused on Romans right now, but I do want to emphasize that the righteous will live by faith. Paul is basically setting up a standard. If you have faith, you will live a righteous life. Righteousness and faith go hand in hand in this case. So, we've gotten through the introductory portion. We've gotten through Paul's introduction. And I hope you saw what was going on there. We opened very clearly with an introduction of Paul and who he is. We got who he is writing to, the Romans. We've gotten his thanksgiving. And we've gotten his theme of this letter. Can you imagine, just curious, this is kind of a funny thing for me. Can you imagine writing a letter or email like that today? Could you imagine, like, if I wrote that? I, Raven, a disciple of Jesus Christ, who is living in South Carolina at the point of this letter, am writing to you, my brothers and sisters in Tokyo, Japan, who until this point, it would be a very long opening. Oh, those of you out there who receive letters or mail from me regularly, get ready. I may have to try this. I may have to try writing like this. That could be fun. But moving on from that, we've gotten through our introduction. Now it's time to get into the meat of the letter. And we got to take this very seriously, guys. Like I said, Paul is basically going to open up by explaining to us the nature of salvation and why we need to be saved. And in order for us to understand that, we can't talk about salvation and righteousness until we understand sin and its nature. I have been asked many times about what is sin? Like, what does sin look like? Is this thing a sin? What's the difference between this and this in terms of sin? That kind of thing. Paul's going to lay out a lot of that here. So brace yourselves. This is going to get heavy. The wrath of God, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them, For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. There's a lot there. Wow. Okay, so first let's ask a question, looking at verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. The wrath of God is being revealed. Now here's a question. People often talk about, if God is a loving God, why would he show wrath upon people? Well, that begs a different question. Why would God be angry at sinful people? Here's why. He's basically explaining it. Godlessness and wickedness suppresses the truth. Wickedness suppresses the truth. Now, what is the truth? The gospel is the truth. God is the truth. God's existence and his divinity is the truth. People who are wicked and sinful have substituted the truth about him for what is a lie. They have stifled the truth God naturally reveals to all people in order to believe anything that supports their own lifestyle. And God cannot tolerate sin because his nature is morally perfect. God cannot ignore or condone willful rebellion. Think about that. God is perfection. Heaven is perfection because it's a reflection of God's perfection. When we sin, we replace God and his perfection for an easier truth, a truth that is more self-serving. That's why it says here, they suppress the truth by their wickedness. Follow that up with, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. This part gives me chills, and I'll explain why. I was once watching an interview with Richard Dawkins, a very popular New Age atheist. And he was asked once, what would it take if God were real to get him to believe? What would it take? What would God have to do to prove himself to Richard Dawkins? And Richard replied, nothing. There is most likely nothing God could ever do to get me to believe. And he even presented examples. If God wrote in the stars, I am God, believe in me. If God showed up in person, like the second coming, just came in person and said that he was God, Richard still says he wouldn't believe because he would attribute it first to aliens or to hallucinations or illusions. This is what it means to replace the truth for self-centered lifestyles and desires. Because it's hilarious to me. The Bible here, verse 20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Clearly seen. Why? And you're probably thinking, well, where have we seen them? If you're near a window, look outside and you'll see it. I was just talking about this today with my Bible study group. God's fingerprints are on all of creation. If you go walking through the woods, let me give you a visual example. If you go walking through the woods and you see a log cabin run down and abandoned, do you think, wow, that just showed up there? Or do you think someone must have built that and left it? We know the hand of creation when we see it. When you see a painting in an art gallery, you don't think, man, some paint must have fallen from the sky and just splattered in just the right way to make this. You think someone's hand carefully and meticulously painted this portrait. And when you see a log cabin in the middle of the woods, you don't think, wow, that just randomly popped there. That just happened to appear. No, you know that someone's hand put the logs there to make the cabin. There is no question about that. And yet we look at the intricacy of the universe, the intricacy of nature itself, and we dare to think, nah, that was all mere chance. Just a random happenstance. The result of probability. Really? That is what Richard Dawkins proposes. That's what many New Age atheists propose. And when God presents himself more clearly than even that, if God were to show up personally and say, hey, here I am, it still wouldn't be enough for some people because they choose not to accept the evidence before them. The evidence is made plain, right? Like, look at verse 19 again. Romans 1 verse 19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Everything about God is demonstrated. And Paul even says this was clear even in the beginning of the universe, the beginning of the world, it was clear. You know what's funny? We talk about the flood, with Noah. The flood with Noah. The people at that time probably knew who God was. They just didn't care. And yet God wiped them out because they knew God existed and didn't care about God, didn't care what he had to say. They still chose to rebel. And here, people have evidence of God all around them and the gospel being presented to them, and their response is, I still can't be sure. I still can't be sure. And then you have people like Dawkins who say, even if God were to present himself right to me, I still would not believe. That is what it means to replace truth with wickedness. Let's move on. Verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. This is talking about idolatry. I'm reading a Bible study book by Greg Ogden. In his discipleship book, he said this, quote, all too often we create a God who is simply the projection of the God we wish existed. I'm going to read that. I'm going to read that again. I love that. All too often, we create a God who is simply the projection of the God that we wish existed. That is what idolatry is. Some people like to say idolatry is just, like little statues, like little Buddha statues, or little Asherah poles, or stuff like that. Idolatry is more than that. Idolatry is replacing the God that is with things we want to replace him with. And that can be anything from, sure, it could be a Buddha statue, but it could also be a video game console. It could be money. It could be your job. It could be your family. Whatever you want to put in the way of God, the thing you want to be your God, is your idol. And here, he's giving examples. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. What does that tell us? If Greg Ogden is right and we replace the immortal God that is with what we wish were God, this tells us, I especially like this, made to look like a mortal human. The humanist movement. The idea that human beings are their own gods. This is what Paul is talking about. When you start making your gods normal humans or mortal creatures, birds, animals, people. And today we call it the humanist movement. Verse 24. We're moving on. Let's keep going. Sorry. This kind of stuff really makes me passionate. Let's go. Let's keep going. 24. Therefore God gave them over. We're going to come back to that. Hold on to that thought. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Let's take a step back and look at that phrase. Therefore God gave them over. Okay. When people talk about hell and God, they often say the same thing. Criticism of God usually comes down to this. Why would God send people to hell? Why would God send people to hell? And here we see Paul addressing that to some degree. But the phrasing is interesting. God gave them over. Which is basically a way of saying God allowed them to go. God gave them over to sinful desire, to their hearts. Because that's what we wanted. Wasn't that clear from verse 21 to 23? They claimed to be wise, yet acted like fools. They abandoned God for created things. They said, God, we don't need you. I'm my own God. I'm going to make idols and statues of men and women and birds and beasts and fish. These will be my new gods. These will be what I want to worship. And God said, okay. Okay, go for it. Yeah, if that's what you want. See, that's the thing about God. He provides us free will to make the choice to live that way. He knows it's wrong, but if that's what we really want, God loves us so much, He says, I'm not going to force you to love me. I'm not going to force you to stay in my shadow. I'm not going to force you to live under me if that's not what you want to do. But accept the consequences when the consequences come knocking. And they do come knocking. So when people say, why does God send us to hell? My response is, He didn't send us. We wanted to go. We said, we know better. We said, we like the look of this thing, this pretty thing. And God said, if that's what you want, son, go on. Isn't that scary? We are often the agents of our own destruction. He follows that up. In the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Moving on to verse 26, and I will warn you right now, verse 26 gets heavy. All right? So bear with me. We will explain it. Here we go. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Okay, there it is. These two verses, verses 26 through 27, are two of the verses in the Bible that call out homosexuality behavior as sinful. Now let's talk about this in context. You'll notice that nowhere in 26 or 27 does it call for us to kill, hurt, or publicly shame people who behave in homosexual ways. What it does do is call it sinful and explain why. So why? Notice the emphasis on natural way. They suffer within themselves the penalty they desire. Because remember what I said before, God gave them over to these lusts. This is what they wanted. They said, this is what I am attracted to. This is what I want to have insert itself into my body or be part of my body. This is what I want to do. It is not natural. It is not what God intended, but it is what I want. Read it again. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. God created man and woman in the book of Genesis. It makes it clear. God created man and woman to come together in one flesh, that is sex, have children, procreate, and be prosperous. That was the natural way in which God created it. If you even want to remove God from that discussion, it's biological. It is biological. A male creature and a female creature come together and reproduce to create offspring. If you want to remove God entirely from this discussion and just say that mankind's only purpose is to reproduce and evolve down the bloodline to make sure that your bloodline endures, homosexuality is counterintuitive to biology. It is not a natural thing. If it's what you want to live with, that's your prerogative, but it is not natural by the natural law or by God's law. And because of that, it is considered sinful. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received to themselves, this is the big part, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, what is the due penalty? Sometimes the due penalty isn't just hell. I mean, people always like to say, oh, well, it's hell. It may be more than that. There may be more to that. It could be social. It could be medical, like sexually transmitted diseases and the like. But they received for themselves the due penalty for their error. There was penalty. This is serious stuff, guys. And please note this as I say it. Please note this as I read this. I am not calling for hurting or condemnation of anyone who lives in sexual impurity. What I am saying is that God has made it clear his stance on it, that it is not a natural thing. And those who defy the natural way that God intended things also defy God. I have heard many modern, very woke, very progressive Christians try to adjust these verses, try to add new context to these verses, but Paul couldn't be more clear here. These actions and behaviors are sinful. Now, before anyone starts getting upset, understand this. Everyone's sinful. Everyone is guilty of sin, be it sexual or otherwise. Everyone's guilty of sin. Okay? That's made clear later in this very book. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we'll get to that verse. We'll get to that and talk about it in full context. But we have to recognize we are guilty of sin. All of us. This is no different. So before any of us Christians go after our homosexual brothers and sisters, be careful. He without sin cast the first stone, as Jesus said. We should love and care for our brothers and sisters and try to save them, not condemn them. It is not our place to condemn. It is our place to save. That's all I'm going to say on that point. If you want to have a further conversation about this, we can have it in the comments section. Let's keep going. We're almost done. All right. Moving on to verse 28. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to depraved minds so that they do what ought not to be done. I like this verse. They thought that the knowledge of God was foolish. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, they thought that it wasn't worthwhile to retain knowledge of God. They thought that it wasn't worth it. And haven't you heard that in today's daily life? I've heard people I heard this one atheist apologist basically explaining that there's nothing worthwhile about studying God or theology because it's all superstition. Doesn't that sound familiar? Paul's calling that out here. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. God! What a list! Oh my goodness. Paul is laying out. I want you all to think for that. I'm going to reread this list. I want you to think in your mind, guys. Does anyone you know in your daily life come to mind when I say these words? Think about it. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. What a and already I can tell you with most of those, someone came to mind for me. And the scary thing is, sometimes they were me like previously in my life. Because some of these were me. I was arrogant a long time ago. Very much arrogant. I was a gossip. I liked to gossip a whole lot. And I was disobedient to my parents many times. So I'm not above any of this. And some of you may have thought of yourselves too. You may have thought, man, that does meet me. As I said before, we are all sinners. And Paul's going to lay that out later in this book. We're all sinners. We've all met some of this criteria. And that right there is part of why this message of salvation is so important. That's why it's so crucial that we have salvation, because these things, they're not just our neighbors, they're not just our friends, and they're not just our family, they're us. Some of these are us. And best one, my favorite part of this is in verse 30. They invent ways of doing evil. They invent ways of doing evil. Gosh, I have seen mankind throughout the history textbooks that I read grow and grow and grow, and we create new awful things, It's like we outdo ourselves constantly. We're in an arms race of sin sometimes. We can outdo each other in terms of what we do to our neighbors and to ourselves. Are we not creating new methods of sexual and personal and social sin and evil? Do we not do this since the dawn of time? It is frightening just how creative humanity can be and just what we choose to do with that creativity. But the final nail in this proverbial coffin is in verse 32, where it says, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Not too long ago, as of the making of this video, Hamas attacked Israel in an attack that was unprovocated and horrendous. It was essentially the equivalent of Israel's own 9/11. Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of how you feel about Israel, what was done was evil. What Hamas did was evil. They killed, raped, and captured hundreds of Israeli citizens and people from around the world. But what shocked me more than the actions of Hamas, because Hamas and Israel have been at each other's throats for decades, what shocked me more was the response from several people. I saw people saying that Hamas should have done worse, that Hamas should have done more, that Hamas should film more of this, praising what Hamas did. And I'm reminded of this verse. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. True evil is not just what you commit, but it's also when you appreciate and praise evil being done unto others. This is dark. This is dark stuff, and I'm sorry that we had to get started on such a dark note, but it's crucial. As we wrap things up, I want to say this very, very serious point. For those of you who are Christian out there who are watching this, have you stopped to consider just what a big deal it is that God saved us from this? From the evil that surrounds us day and night? From the evil that we ourselves are guilty of? We have been given the opportunity to be saved, to be pulled away from that, to be redeemed. It's something that I fear that many Christians, myself included, take for granted. So my message to you today is, if you're a Christian, don't take that for granted. And recognize why the message of salvation is so important. And help yourselves to recognize evil as it is presented, wickedness as it is presented. Do not trade the righteousness and truth that is God and His message for a lie. And for those of you who are not Christian, I hope that you enjoyed this first episode of the Romans series. If you have questions or comments or concerns, hit me up in the comments section. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And keep in mind, guys, this is my first time doing a full Bible study. I know I'm probably going to make some mistakes and make some errors here and there. I'm reading directly from my Bible with notes that I've made right next to me. So if y'all feel like this could have been improved in some way, or if I could have done something different, please let me know in the comments. I'd love your critique. Keep all things respectful, guys. I really appreciate this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned as we get ready to move into chapter 2 next time. Until then, thank you guys. God bless and Godspeed. Have a great one.